Okay, fourth and final source of market failures. Here's a term that you've probably never heard of called externalities. An externality. What in the heck is that? All right, so I'm going to read you a little definition here. An externality is the uncompensated impact of one person's action on the well-being of a bystander. Huh? The uncompensated, so there's no money changing hands, impact of one person's action, so there's something going on the well-being. Well, well-being can be a positive or negative thing on a bystander, right? So you're just walking down the street and it affects you. The easiest way to think about externalities, is spillover. So you're walking down the street and something happens and sort of spills over onto you and affects you. So if it's a negative, event, then you could think of it as a spillover cost, right? Which is sort of a negative. Here's an example. A couple of quick examples, right? You're sitting at a light, windows down, nice day, and all of a sudden, this car pulls up next to you and it's blaring the most obnoxious music ever. Well, look, you're just sitting there minding your own business, and now you're being affected negatively by this spillover, by this negative externality. And that's a cost to you, okay? Versus a benefit. For instance, you're walking down the road, and there's a football stadium next to you. It's in the evening, and they have a fireworks display, and you get to enjoy the fireworks display. So how nice is that, right? Again, uncompensated, but it's think of it as a positive or a benefit spillover to you. Okay. That's what an externality is. And the thing about externalities is, again, this is the way to think about them, okay? A negative externality, generally speaking, is some form of pollution, okay? So let's just talk about that for a sec. So let's talk about a negative externality. So if I take a market, and here's my supply and here's my demand, I could also write this as marginal benefit and marginal cost, right? And I have some price, some quantity. Now this is a negative, right? A negative externality. So what we're talking about here is the creation of some form of pollution, okay? And so this is where things get a little wonky in terms of previous discussions we've had about supply and demand and cost and benefit and things like that. All right. So this is some market quantity of a negative externalities pollution that's being being produced. Okay. And again, if we think of a negative externality, if we think of the pollution as a cost, well, where are we going to add it? We're going to add it into the marginal cost. So much like before, we just add, but this is the cost of addressing the pollution, right? So this becomes the marginal social cost, or what's socially optimal or socially, good or beneficial, okay? And so what you end up with is a price. I'm going to put SO for socially optimal. There's the socially optimal price and the quantity of pollution that's socially optimal. So you can see that the social optimal quantity is less than the market is providing, right? Which means what? It means that markets overproduce when it comes to negative externalities, okay? So, outputs that create negative externalities tend to be overproduced, all right? Now, let's talk about the price, because with an additional higher price to address the negative externality, who pays for that? Well, it could be the cost could be internalized, right? Because how do a lot of times negative externalities, pollution and stuff, how does the government deal with them, right? The government deals with them through policy and regulations. So if the government just comes up with a regulation and says, look, you can't dump that motor oil in the lake anymore or in the street, then the firm internalizes that cost and ends up bearing the burden for that. The other way, though, is the government can institute a tax, and this is a special tax. It's called a Pigovian, named after Pigou, an economist. And what he said was this tax right here is charged, and then proceeds or revenue from the tax go to addressing or cleaning up the pollution or negative externality. And what's interesting about a Pigovian tax and unique about a Pigovian tax is, recall in the previous video, a tax made a market inefficient because it created deadweight loss. It prevented the market from operating at a quantity that was socially optimal. Well, look what is happening here. The socially optimal quantity is actually here. So a Pigovian tax is the only tax, or one of the few taxes, that does not create deadweight loss, because it forces the market to operate at the socially optimal level. Okay? Yeah. Let's talk about a positive. The best way to understand positive externalities is to think about the arts. Not all of the time, but a large majority of the time, the arts, whether we're talking about symphonies or museums or community theater or things like that. Let's look at. Everybody would agree that those are good for society, right? I mean, art brings out the best in who we are as humans, and it's uplifting, right? So it's good stuff. But if you look at a market, so there's demand, marginal benefit, and supply, marginal cost, and here's a market price and a market quantity. All right, this is the amount of art, the amount of positive externality that is deemed socially beneficial. Where are we going to put it? Well, we're not going to put it as a cost. We're going to put it as a benefit. And so we put it here, and this becomes the marginal social benefit. And here we go. So the quantity that's socially optimal is more than the market provides, and that kind of makes sense, right? If you thought about a market just left unto itself, how much operas are going to be, right? I mean, it's popular and many people like it, but a market always underproduces when it comes to positive externalities. And so what happens is you got to intercede to find the marginal social benefit and create a greater number of whether we're talking museums or community theater. Okay, now what that does though is where this line hits the original demand line, sort of gives us our socially optimal price, right? So here's the socially optimal price. Here's sort of the market price, but we have a problem because we've now shifted and we're creating a greater quantity that actually results in an even higher price up here. And the difference between what it really costs And what people are willing to pay, the socially optimal price, is represented here. One of the best ways of understanding this or explaining this has to do with electric cars. Okay, so electric cars, very popular at the turn of the last century. So we're talking going from 1899 to 1900, right? If you look at that time frame, electric cars, steam cars, gas cars, all active, and a big chunk of the market was, the market was devoted to electric cars. They were easy to start. They were much easier to sort of maintain and operate than, say, a steam car or even a gas car. And then all that changed when the electric starter was invented and put on the gasoline cars, and it made them easy to start. So they disappeared from the market. But then beginning, roughly 1970s, the government stepped in and said, hey, for various reasons, environmental and otherwise, electric cars are a good thing. Well, it took them decades to kind of get there, but eventually, a little firm by the name of Tesla, right? What the government did is determine that the quantity of electric cars wasn't sufficient, and that the socially optimal quantity was much greater. And so the question becomes, how do you address the pricing? And here's what governments do: they subsidize. So they pay the difference, right? They pay the difference between what the socially optimal price is and what the actual price to get the socially optimal quantity into the market. And in the case of electric cars, if you accounted for the subsidy, the electric, Teslas, when they first came out, and I mean, it's been a while since I checked, it's probably still going on. I don't know the level to which Tesla is still being subsidized in the production of their vehicles, but what you pay for a Tesla didn't even come close to reflecting what the actual cost or price of that. But that was because they at one point in time, I think they were receiving something like a $40,000 subsidy per vehicle that was produced. And again, why would you subsidize that? Well, from the government's perspective, to get the socially optimal quantity of this positive externality. So that's a little bit about externalities, right? So we talked about the fact that negative externalities tend to be overproduced. The outputs tend to be overproduced. Positive externalities tend to be underproduced. And the way that the government addresses them and addresses these market failures is, in the case of negative externalities, there's policy regulation and then a Pagovian tax if necessary. And then in the case of positive externalities, there's subsidies. So hope that makes sense, and we'll talk to you soon.